Okay, I believe we are now live. Martin is in Turkey and is having a bit of difficulty getting through. So I am just at this moment trying to figure out if I am on air and if folks are able to listen. And I am just looking now at the chat, and Deborah is saying, she said she saw a thanks for attending, which may have been me closing out the previous meeting and then adding the new meeting, to which it looks like I can now get the audio and video. So I'm waiting for someone else to maybe chat in. Let me just type in here, are we live? Can you see me? Okay, so Martin says, I can see you. That is me as Martin typing, are we live? Can you see me? Martin says yes. Okay. Martin, let me just ask you a quick question. Is there anything I need to do to record the session? Oh, it records automatically. Okay. Well, I am going to try to do one little tricky thing, and then we'll get started. Okay, so I have a slide that I may introduce into the talk, and obviously I'm going to be doing this talk without Martin, so I apologize. I'm going to be the moderator and the presenter here. So the idea for this second discussion is framed around something that I call the monster's journey, which is meant to contrast or to sit alongside the well-known hero's journey. And the way that this topic generated and seemed a natural follow-up from last discussion with Martin is that we talked a bit about partnering and an integral relationship from the perspective of having shadow elements, having what are called encapsulated identities, having parts of the self that are developmentally wounded or traumatized. And I think this is an important topic in a couple of ways that I talked about last discussion. One of them is that I think a lot of us in the integral community, or who are drawn to sort of lives of practice and self-development, we often have some of these developmental wounds. And so we ourselves are on this kind of journey. And then, as Martin was presencing in the conversation last time, because of our high levels of complexity, if we've been practicing for some time, we're really drawn to other people who have high levels of complexity, and often that includes some early developmental trauma or wounding. So this is really a topic that's germane to us on both sides of an integral relationship, whether we ourselves are carrying that early wounding or we are partnering. with someone who has that early wounding. So that takes us back to what I call the monster's journey. But before we do that, we want to review the basics of the hero's journey. And this, of course, is Joseph Campbell's formulation. More recently, this has been something that a fellow named Jordan Peterson has introduced in more back into the mainstream. The language had fallen out a little bit of mainstream usage. And the hero's journey is just this narrative or storied kind of metaphor for how it is that we grow through life. And the idea is that the hero starts off in some comfortable situation in the village or life that they know. And then there is some kind of catalyzing event, or sometimes a catastrophe, sometimes a threat, or sometimes a loss. And that wakes the hero up out from his very comfortable place in life. And it's a call, and the call is to adventure, that the hero has to do something in response to this loss or threat or catastrophe. So we can imagine a safe village, and one day a large dragon flies by and burns down the local farms. And the hero, who's living his normal life, is therefore called to either track or confront, possibly try to slay the dragon to save the villagers. And on the way, there are some characteristic sort of events that happen in the books or in the stories, what Joseph Campbell called the monomyth, meaning that this mythological theme showed up over and over again of heroes getting calls to adventure. And in this call to adventure, there's a confrontation with magical forces and unseen worlds. There's usually the presence of guides and helpers for the hero. And then eventually, in most of the hero stories we know, the hero slays the dragon or overcomes the challenge, and then returns to his or her village, as it were, to sort of bestow the blessings that they have gotten on this journey. And on a psychological level, the meaning of the hero's journey is that we exist in states of comfort. Robert Keegan might call them states of equilibrium, where we're pretty well balanced. But then life will present a challenge to us, and we're called to discover or confront aspects of ourselves that are beyond what we know or are conscious of. So we may go deep into our shadows and confront forces there. We may take up a spiritual journey and be exposed to the sort of transpersonal aspects of states or stages, whatever language we might use. And then we use that to help reintegrate ourselves at a new and higher level. So it's really describing this developmental process all along. We get the call, we move into the unknown, we reintegrate into ourselves, and we have grown. And this goes over and over again. Now, to go back to the monster's journey, what I believe, and this is my experience, and I can speak a little bit about this, is that the hero's journey works for pretty much everybody to a certain extent, because the structure of that transformation process is very, very similar. But I believe that we get more out of the stories if we change the characters a little bit for a certain group of people. And that group of people would be people who have early developmental trauma. And so what is early developmental trauma? It has actually a pretty strict definition. And the definition that's used now is something called adverse childhood experiences. So these are things like physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect or abandonment, parental mental illness or addiction, parent dying, child being orphaned, parent going to jail. So it's a divorce is also in there too. And it turns out that about 60% of the population has some of this early developmental trauma, but that as we kind of move up the ladder into having 2, 3, 4, 5 of these particular developmental traumas, we get into a different zone, and the challenges that are faced by people with these multiple adverse childhood experiences seem to be quite a bit higher. So the incidence of mental illness goes up rapidly, or exponentially. The rates of physical illness even go up rapidly. And this is really well done research. It was done by Kaiser. And I'm going to try actually to share a screen here and see if I can. I believe I've turned on sharing screen, or I'm about to do it. Let's see. I'm going to share that. And maybe you can see this slide. Hopefully you can. And this is just a table of adverse child experiences among the big study that was done. So 17,000 Kaiser Permanente members surveyed. And then they were asked, had they had these categories of adverse child experiences, and they just ticked the boxes if they had and got a point for each type. So 27% of females experience physical abuse, for example, 30% of men, of boys at that while they were growing up. So 28% overall experienced recurrent and severe physical abuse. And then they go through the rows for emotional abuse, sexual, physical neglect, and then growing up with substance abuse, a family member being imprisoned, household mental illness, parental separation, and the mother being treated violently, and they probably should have added the father. And what you see is it's about between 10 and 30% for each category. And then, of course, people are experiencing overlapped categories. So this then puts people in what I would say is the monsters category. And so here I'm going to describe how I think it's different. So I think that we can't take with a person with a lot of developmental trauma, they're not like a Luke Skywalker figure in Star Wars, who is sort of this very normal teenage boy who gets the call to adventure early in the movie series and then heads out to find it. That people with developmental trauma are different. And I'm going to use the metaphor of the monster. And there are a couple other metaphors that I use if the monster doesn't work. But it's the way that I like to introduce the topic, which is that the Luke Skywalker figure is more like a troll under a bridge. So the developmentally traumatized person, the person with this very early wounding, has already been transformed early on into something that to them on a psychological level makes them feel not quite human the way that other people feel. And they, in this metaphor, sit in contrast to sort of the villagers who live outside or beyond the bridge and who seem to be living something of a normal life compared to the monster. And so if the monster gets the call, and the call might be an interaction with the villagers, then the monster is called towards a confrontation with normality. So this is a very different structure than the hero's journey, where the hero is called to visit the magical world. Here, the monster is called to visit the normal world. And yet it's a difficult call from the beginning because there's pain there. The developmental trauma, the early childhood experiences have caused this pain and have made the monster feel different from the humans, so to speak, who are in the village. And in order for it to proceed, the monster must have some contact with a villager or villagers that has an element of compassion in it, and which the monster is seen not to be a monster in the negative sense. So there are lots of movies where we see this theme, where the monster or the alien being or whatnot confronts at least some villagers or some people in the normal world who treat it with compassion. And it's through this meeting with compassion that the monster begins to discover his or her nature. And the way I want to talk about that is that one of the consequences of developmental trauma is that it creates pain and creates tremendous suffering for the child, which is carried up and on through life. But it also creates some element of a gift in the person. It creates some quality or some ability that is sort of outsized relative to what it might have been. So that could be a gift of sort of healing or creativity, a gift of awareness or determination, a gift of particular kind of insight. And so the monster has this gift, but it's not really a gift that means much because it hasn't been redeemed and connected to the world. So it's sort of a gift that is in hiding under the bridge. And it's in the connection with the normal villagers that the monster first has the opportunity to see him or herself in this positive light and in the light of compassion, and then to see the gift that was created through the early developmental trauma, and then perhaps to be able to start to use that gift with others. And that is kind of the redemption, if you like, of the trauma, or the redemption of the early childhood loss. And ultimately, if this happens, it proceeds to a sense of connection, because the ultimate sort of or the end loss of that early childhood period was a disconnection with relationships and with relationships with other people. So it's the primary wound of developmental trauma is that it's often carried out against us by other people. And so this is a very painful part of it, is most of the things that we're looking for in these adverse childhood experiences are not necessarily car crashes or random tragedies or acts of God, volcanoes and earthquakes, etc. They're things that are perpetrated or carried out by the ones that we love. So physical abuse, sexual abuse, all these things are much more likely to be done by family members, parents, extended family, and so on. So when the monster finally confronts the normal world and the villagers, discovers compassion, discovers his or her gift, and begins to use it, then there is the opportunity to be connected. And that is the redemption. As far as I see, that's the journey for the monster. And it's not that a monster can't hear the hero's journey and take the hero's journey up in some ways or use the same ideas. It's just that it's not going to be exactly the same for them. And I think we need to take a look at our psycho-spiritual practices and sort of ask, are they monster friendly, as it were? And in my experience, a lot of them are, and then there are a lot of times where not so much, that the discourse is really aimed towards people who have a more normal upbringing as opposed to a more developmentally traumatized upbringing. And that shift in view makes a difference for how at home and how sort of aligned people are going to feel with the practices that they're doing and the issues that might come up. So let me switch there then to the question of relationships and to just highlight some things, and then maybe I'll take some questions, assuming we're all still going forward. So, if you are sort of this monster archetype, and there are two other archetypes that seem to work for people, and I'll pause and mention this. Some people don't like the monster imagery. It doesn't work for them. I think it works for me, which is how it first came to me. But in speaking with a lot of people, there was a preference among some. Some people like the alien as a metaphor, which is a little bit of like the sense of I shouldn't be here, or I don't want to be here, or I'm not comfortable on this plane of existence, as a response to their developmental trauma. It's a little more dissociative, detached. It has sort of an unearthly quality. And yet the challenges and the call is the same, which is to engage the world of the quote unquote normal and typical in order to reconnect to it. So E.T. is a nice archetypal movie for that, for that quality. Starman might be another good one. So some people feel they have this quality of the alien. And then the other one that seems to resonate with people is the kind of archetype of the mutant. So I was human and I've been changed by something. And the question becomes, how did I get there? And maybe how do I rejoin or come back? But I think it has a lot of the same qualities of the monster journey. So I would just say you can pick any one of those that may fit. And it might be that in teaching this material, it becomes clearer that there are even more categories. But those are the ones I've chatted about with clients and such. So if you're a monster, let's just say, and you want a relationship, the upshot of that is that there's more sort of early parts of yourself that are a bit more scattered or fractured into pieces, because that's what developmental trauma does. It sort of takes the psyche and sort of moves the psyche into many sort of pieces. And so relationships become complex because we have to orientate to all these parts of ourselves and voices. Some of them might be scared, some of them might be angry, some of them might be clinging. And so there's a journey to just being able to be in relationship more or less in a normal way, but that journey to just even quasi normality is quite a bit tougher. So there's a longer learning curve for folks who have this early developmental trauma. And if we're then dating people who have this, we have to bring, I think, a level of understanding and compassion to it, that their journey through themselves is more tumultuous and presents with more extremes, a little more disorganization. And if we're trying to take a sort of normal relationship frame and just set it on top of our partner who's on the monster's journey, then we are sort of doing that person a disservice. And so if we're in a relationship with somebody with this kind of history, we have to be aware of that and respond, I think, accordingly, which is with heightened compassion, heightened awareness, a little bit of heightened responsibility for, the fact that we're interacting with a being who's a bit more fragile and weird from the perspective of a certain point of view. Okay, so I monologued that, and let's see. I'm going to say let's try to open it up to questions. And I'm looking here at the chat window, and a little wonky. I've never used this program before. So I have someone, Martin says, I have someone in the training who says he is an alien. Yes, I've encountered lots of folks who have that feeling in spiritual communities, that they have trouble being on this plane of existence. And people who know him even joke about him going off to his planet. Martin says another woman here feels that the gods love everyone and they are happy, but the gods don't love her. So that's a really good sign, or a really common sign for this kind of feeling. Like, the gods love everybody, but the gods don't love me. So again, just cast that image to, you're the troll under the bridge. Everybody else is, navigating this world of the outside and of the light, and God loves them all, but not you. You're under the bridge. So that's that feeling. And I'm saying in most cases that can be traced to this developmental trauma, sometimes to really attachment trauma with the parents, even, personality disorders in the parents, things that did not go well in the early environment. So if you have that core feeling, we want to recognize that that's the case. We want to excavate a little bit where that came from. And we want to have compassion for ourselves, that is the case, that's a hard feeling to carry around in your life. And that also there may be a gift that developed there that is important to attend to. So Okay, next one. Mark, Mark, would you speak to a partnership where one person is highly aware of their alien's journey and has done a lot of work, and the other has a lot of damage but thinks they are not? So great question. So I would say that, with this kind of material, the most important thing for the monster or the alien to have is a conscious awareness that this happened to them and that they are committed to recovery, essentially. That they recognize that there were these wounds, that shifted their perspective, and that they are wanting to work on these things, how to attach, how to have a relationship, how to, utilize their gift in the world. If a person has had all these things happen to them, but that they are not aware or not motivated fully to recover, there's very little that can be done. So a lot of damage is done by, you could say this way, monsters who are not in recovery. The world is full of them. And if we're considering a relationship, we need to consider this question of, is the monster, alien, mutant I'm in a relationship with, do they see, can they take that perspective, as we would say in Integral, and are they committed to making changes? And they don't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be, and it's not realistic to think about, they just are transformed and all of that pain goes away. It's more like the commitment to see it and work with it in an imperfect way, but in a way that, as the 12-step groups might say, progress but not perfection. We can live with that, and one can relate and be in relationship to a person who's committed to progress. If the person doesn't want to see, it's too painful, then they're not ready. So that's an evaluation we have to make for ourselves and really need to. Martin asks, how do we prevent burning out? And here I'm going to assume that burning out means burning out with being in a relationship with a person who's on the monster's journey. I think, the question is, how far along are they, one, in their journey? If they're fresh into it at age, 25, it's going to be tough. I have a couple in my practice where one of the members, both on the monster's journey, but there's a big age difference, and you can see it's just practice. The older partner has a lot more practice and a lot more awareness of the sort of monster parts, and the younger partner, just as due to time, doesn't. And so there's more chaos from her end. And so there's something about time and practice that's really important. We also have to know, if we're not on the monster's journey, do we have a savior complex? Are we looking to rescue? And there's a difference between helping and rescuing. The attitude of, I can save you. So we want to be mindful of that kind of complex in ourselves, that we're not looking for someone to save, because that will burn us out, the savior attitude. Bill, can you give an example of the monster's journey in a movie or book? There's lots of examples that come up that 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 come close to the sort of weaving of the archetypes. I mean, I'm taking some creative license here, but a movie like E.T. is a really good example. A movie like Starman is a good example. You can see it in movies like in lots of monster movies where there's this hint that the monster doesn't have the motivation just to destroy, but has the motivation in some way to protect, but people don't understand that. I'm thinking of one in particular. There's a Steven Spielberg movie that was not maybe about a decade ago that had that theme with its alien monster that they were there to help. Ender's Game is one that comes up as a book in which the aliens or the buggers get portrayed at first as murderous, but then as not, and the character struggles morally with that. I'm going to have to, though, brush up on my movies and books. As I'm reading this question, I realize that I realize I could be quicker on the draw with these. So I will thank you for the question, and I'm going to do better next time. Martin, she said she had terrible parents. I think this is referring back to the alien list, so there you go. Martin, we use this list, and she says all apply to her. So if we're talking about the adverse childhood experience list, and you've got multiple boxes. So in the research on adverse childhood experiences, once we're getting up to 3 or 4 of these boxes, that's when the tougher life health outcomes seem to really show up. So if you have 1, you're at a little more risk of depression or other kinds of forms of mental illness, for example. 2, you're that much more likely. Once we get into 3 and 4, it starts to really spike. And I'm not saying that's inevitable. I'm saying that means you need more treatment. Okay. So Martin's reading the list of sort of attitudes. I'm alone. I'm on my own. I'm bad. I'm evil. I'm going to get in trouble. I'm selfish. It's my fault. I'm a disappointment. I don't belong. I'm a burden. I'm crazy. I'm different. I'm not enough. I'm a failure. I don't have. I'm deprived or impoverished. I'm not important. I'm inferior. I'm invisible. I'm not loved. I don't matter. Powerless. I'm too much. Unworthy. I'm not wanted. I'm worthless. I'm disposable. I'm wrong. So those are attitudes that I think most people would have in some parts of themselves, but the person on the monster journey is going to have a lot of those attitudes, and they're going to have them at this higher level of intensity that just isn't going to make sense. I'm thinking now of, the comedian Richard Pryor, who probably had, I don't know, all the adverse childhood experiences, and and what a gifted force he was in the world in a certain way, and then in another way, he was I think could be abusive himself, and was a difficult character who lived a troubled life. But here we see some of the gift, for sure, and then some of the suffering. Reminds me of Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf. Does this fit? I'm going to have to think about that, whether that fits archetypally. Beauty and the Beast, Deborah says, thank you. That's probably one of the best ones. Bill says, Mark, what age range are we looking for here? And I would say the age range is you can think about it in terms of when did these events happen, and usually it's in the range of 0 to 6 or 0 to 7 that we see this big developmental shift. I liken it, and in another analogy, it's like trying to build a house during a constant set of earthquakes, 0 to 7, with all this developmental trauma in a family. It's like you can imagine the building is going to be very unstable. So that's the age range. And then there's all kinds of regular integral developmental stuff in terms of age range that we would look for later in life. She is the first who said, I am all... Okay. During what age range are we susceptible to this type of trauma? Yeah. Okay. So let me see if there are any more final questions. I have a few minutes that I can go over. I appreciate everybody's time. I hope that I've done okay with this, considering we're flying solo here. It's a very interesting experience going for it. And yeah, so I'm just checking out if anybody has some final thoughts. Martin says, so it later affects all further stages of development. Yes. So this is where it gets super interesting from an integral perspective. The early trauma weaves into our early subjectivity, our sense of who we are. And then that gets taken up by the self system that grows through the stages. So it's really interesting, because unless somebody has had an incredibly traumatizing childhood, off the charts, we still continue to grow. And we can grow through the stages. And what happens is, as we go through the stages, certain sort of elements of the trauma get presenced in our awareness by life events, just by sort of internal process of growing in complexity. And so my feeling is that it doesn't stop stage growth. In most cases, it just weaves into stage growth, and that when we're moving through stages, part of the work, if we have the monster's journey, is to try to see the parts of us that are very hurt, and identify those parts and sort of separate them a little bit from our wiser minds. So we have to do some kind of work on ourselves and in questioning ourselves. Where does this idea about myself come from? Does it come from this earlier period? And we try to use our complexity that we develop in stage growth to tease apart these subtleties. Martin says, so in therapy, do we start top down or bottom up? I think it depends on what's happening. So, if someone comes in and they're in kind of a crisis, or they're reacting to this trauma in their life, let's say they've just gone through a divorce, we start with exactly what's happening, bottom up. If someone has had this trauma, but they've been on a developmental path and the trauma isn't really super present at the moment, what is more present is their center of gravity, then we would start working with that. So basically start with what's most available. Deborah asks, would you say we develop more cognitively through the stages but may lag in the emotional line? Yeah, it's a way to put it, for sure, that on the monster's journey, the growth is, I would say it's cognitive and emotional, because all stage growth is emotional in some way. It can't be done fully cognitively, but that there's an extra set of emotions which are really powerful and potent, and they're these traumatic emotions. And we can sort of have this apparently very normal self thinking and feeling in a typical way, but if we're not in touch with the trauma or it's being acted out in other ways, then we lag behind in our awareness of that. It becomes split off or sort of dissociated, even though it's impacting us. And so we have to do this extra work of reintegrating. So the stage of growth is still emotional, but traumatic emotions and typical emotions are different from one another. So we almost have to think about three things. Okay. So Martin, would you say that we should wrap up at this point? And is there anything I should do to wrap this up? So Christine says, one last question. So the monstrous will show up in groups, families. How can compassion be found so the monster can evolve? We need to, the quick answer to that, Christine, is we need to look for helpers and compassionate people. And that's really on us in terms of searching for who can listen and who can hear and who can see, the best in who I am or who the monster is. And that's a journey, but we have to reach out for help to people who we can feel can help us. And that's how the journey gets started. And sometimes that's just one therapist or one friend. One therapist, one friend, one mentor gets the process started. And there's evidence to suggest, in the lives of young people that the difference between somebody who makes it out of a difficult situation and somebody who doesn't is just one caring adult. And I'm not saying that caring adult does all the work, more like they get the process started. Okay. So here's what I'll just say. So this material is taught in my certified integral therapist training program, citintegral.com. It's taught online in an individually paced format. So it's all readings, lectures, and then consultations with myself. And it's appropriate for therapists and coaches. And again, citintegral.com for more information. I work doing psychotherapy in California. I'm in person in San Jose and then online throughout California. And then I do more of a coaching and developmental model with folks from across the world. And that can be done online. And you can find out more information at drmarkforman.com. That's drmarkforman.com. And if you enjoyed, today's presentation, love to hear your feedback. The Monster's Journey stuff is new material in terms of sharing it outside of working with clients. So very happy to hear feedback, thoughts, and reflections. Perhaps you can forward those to Martin, and they will find my way. Okay. I want to thank everybody for being here and for your great chat, dialogue questions. And I will end the meeting. So take care.